Okay, so I expect that we're going to see people joining as we go. I'm going to get started because 90 minutes is a very short time to save the world. Welcome, everybody. And we do have an impressively international audience today to this webinar session, which is asking the question, is gene editing a sustainable food system solution? I'll start with a question. Can we define sustainability without falling back on old tropes, such as working with nature or meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs? Phrases like this are so easy to say, and indeed are said by all of us, myself included, but also abused by so many that as a result, we could argue that they have lost a great deal of their meaning and potency. Now, that may sound harsh thing to say, and yet I know of nowhere in the world where we're making really meaningful progress in sustainability. We are, for instance, significantly off target in meeting all of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress on more than 50% of them is judged to be weak or insufficient, and 30% have stalled or reversed. A recent 2023 update on the Planetary Boundaries Framework found that we are living well beyond 6 of the 9 boundaries that are judged to be critical for maintaining the stability and the resilience of the Earth system as a whole. And things have been this way for a very long time, and it leads me to ask whether there is something fundamentally wrong in the way we understand or are interpreting the notion of sustainability, whether the solutions that we are putting forward for sustainability are too little too late, too focused on the global and not enough on the local, too focused on driving new economies and building new markets, or simply too impractical to become common practice. Questions around sustainability are urgent in all areas, and maybe particularly so in agriculture. And these kinds of big questions were in our heads long before the European Commission announced in 2022 that it was going to bring forward a sustainability criteria, and further that aspects of this criteria could be applied to new genomic techniques, also known as gene editing, or here in the UK, precision bred organisms. And there were even rumors at the time that these sustainability criteria might replace conventional risk assessment of NGTs. In the last couple of years, much of the European Farm to Fork and New Green Deal proposals, including the sustainability criteria, have fallen by the wayside. But the notion that gene editing could be part of a sustainable food system has persisted. And as always, there are strong views on all sides of this debate. From our perspective, the more we've looked into this issue of whether gene editing can be part of a sustainable food system solution, the more it's become apparent that you can't just look at gene editing in isolation. The choice and the use of technology, the philosophies that underpin that choice are interlinked and need to be viewed as part of a whole system approach. This means before we can even start to address the issue of whether gene editing is a sustainable solution, we need to embrace the complexity of the issue and ask those other deeper questions about what we mean by sustainability. So for today's session, we've been especially keen to bring people into this discussion whose work doesn't focus narrowly on genetic engineering, but who have instead spent time looking at sustainability and the bigger picture of what this means and what prevents us from making progress, and then perhaps view gene editing within that context. And we are really fortunate today to have a very learned and experienced panel of speakers, and I'll introduce them as we go along. A bit of housekeeping. Our format today is pretty straightforward. Each of our speakers will be given a short opportunity to present their perspectives. We'll have some short follow-up discussion between them, and then we will open the floor to questions from our audience. If I could ask you, audience, please, by all means, use the chat to say hello and to chat between yourselves. But if you have specific questions for our panelists, please can you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and post those there. Makes it much easier for us to find your questions and therefore answer them. And my colleague, Ames Mason, will be running the Q&A later in the session. Speakers, can I ask you please to try and stick to your times, and be aware that I may have to interrupt you if it looks like you're going significantly over. We are recording this session today, and the link to the recording, which will be on our YouTube playlist, will always be sent out to our registrants within a week, along with a suggested reading list and copies of the chat and Q&A. So, can we solve the sustainability conundrum, and perhaps especially the sustainability conundrum around gene editing in 90 minutes? Probably not, but we can aim, as we always try to do with these sessions, to provoke some different thoughts and questions around the issue, which we hope you will be able to ponder and challenge and take forward in one way or another. Now, we do have a slight change. I'm just going to change the view here. Right. So we do have a slight change. Angelica, I don't know why you're there. We do have a slight change in our program today. Try muting your, nope. Okay, that view's not working. Apologies, everybody. We'll go back to this. We do have a slight change today in that Lawrence Woodward, I'm afraid, has at the last minute had to step out because he is not feeling well. Excuse me, but his introduction was quite important to the session, which means if I can beg your forbearance and you can stand to listen to me for another few minutes, I'd like to cover some of the things that Lawrence was going to say, and then we'll move on to our other speakers. I suppose the thing to say is that you gather a group of people concerned about food and farming together in a room, and all of them will agree that our food system needs to be more sustainable, but ask them to say what a sustainable food system is and what farming and production methods it entails, and there will likely be very little agreement. And this has proved to be problematic in a lot of ways. First of all, it prevents significant progress around sustainability, but also as the pressure mounts to integrate technologies such as genetic engineering into agriculture, even into organic and regenerative agriculture, it also becomes a highly charged issue in policy and regulatory circles. In the EU, as I mentioned in my introduction, in 2022, this proposal was put forward for a legislative framework for sustainable food systems, the idea being to integrate sustainability into all food-related policies by adopting criteria for sustainability across the food chain. And this included adding a sustainability criteria to the proposed new legislation for gene editing or new genomic techniques. And in fact, the public consultation for the new NGT regulations included several questions about sustainability criteria, and the responses were predictably mixed. And we had something very similar here in the UK when the Draft Genetic Technology Act was passing through its parliamentary process. At one point, the Labour Party submitted a proposal amendment to the draft legislation to require that gene-edited organisms should be developed for or in connection with a number of sustainability metrics. So these would include things like producing food in a way that protects or enhances the natural environment and supports the sustainable use of resources, growing and managing plants and animals in a way that mitigates or adapts to climate change, conserving genetic resources of native animals and those of plants and their wild relatives, protecting or improving the quality of soil, supporting or improving human health and well-being. Needless to say, that amendment did not get very far. And in fact, I think they ended up withdrawing it as part of the process of compromise that takes place during legislative debate. But within that list of criteria, I think lie some fundamental truths about sustainability. First of all, sustainability defies simple answers. It's nuanced and complex and dynamic. Secondly, approaches to sustainability require us to take a whole system approach rather than looking to fix isolated problems. And thirdly, at least from our perspective, at a bigger conversation, the discussion around sustainability, whether from a corporate or political or even civil society perspective has fallen into the easy habit of using these shorthands, such as working with nature, to describe the overarching aims of sustainability. And within that context, we often talk also about working within planetary boundaries. And there's a downside to this, of course, and that is that our planetary boundaries are considered to be tradable. And this becomes really obvious when you start looking at concepts like the triple bottom line on which the SDGs are based, which seeks to balance social, economic, and environmental factors, sometimes referred to as people, profit, and planet. The problem is those different bottom lines are measured very differently. So while profit can be measured in relatively simple mathematical terms, culture and environment, which are far more complex and changeable, can't. And this makes the three equations difficult to compare, let alone balance, and has led to a situation where we now talk about sustainability very often in terms of green markets and green investment and green profits, often in a way that obscures the fact that the needs of people and planet have, perhaps too often, been dismissed or left out of the equation entirely. Our modest proposal, therefore, is that when we talk about sustainability, it might be better to talk about the things that sustain life, the things that sustain all the living organisms on the planet, things that are fundamental to the biology of living organisms and less easily tradable. So, for instance, structural integrity, ensuring an organism's anatomical structures are intact and functioning optimally, allowing it to grow and thrive. Functional integrity, the optimal functioning of systems such as circulation, respiration, digestion, and reproduction in animals, or photosynthesis, nutrient uptake, growth regulation in plants, as well as carbon and nitrogen cycles. Genetic integrity, prioritizing the preservation of an organism's innate genetic makeup. Ecological integrity, how an organism interacts with its environment and other organisms. And this would include maintaining its niche and contributing to the stability and diversity of its ecosystem. There's also homeostasis, those self-regulating processes, such as temperature and pH and electrolyte balance, which an organism can use to maintain balance and stability in the face of external challenges. And of course, health and well-being, including the absence of disease, injury, any condition that compromises an organism's normal function. It would also encompass both physical health and, in some definitions, for instance, where animals are concerned, mental and behavioral health. This is not an exhaustive list, and it may be that the well-being aspect might also be extended to include things like social values, linked to things such as equity and justice and inclusion and social well-being and quality of life. But you can see, I think, that these prerequisites for life are interlinked. It's hard to have one without the other, and therefore they are not so easily tradable. So following on from these whole system considerations that support life, there is also a need to look at the way agricultural problems and solutions are framed. So for instance, one of the traps that we fall into when we talk about sustainability, particularly where certain technologies are applied, is that we narrow our vision to precise kinds of questions and frames in which the answer is basically already predetermined. It's like the old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Another interesting aspect of this whole system approach to sustainability is that de facto it requires more voices around the table, more input from different perspectives and different people, and a governance structure that is responsive and reflexive enough to integrate these perspectives, to allow them to influence policy and regulation, and that all-important broader vision of our collective as well as our agricultural future. So, in sum, if Lawrence were here today, addressing this idea of the broader vision for agriculture, of where we want to be, and what role sustainability has in all this, I think he would probably be summing up with questions like, sustainability for what? Sustainability for whom? And sustainability to what end? And with that, I'm going to put my chair's hat back on. Try one more time to switch us over to a single person view. Nope, Angelica, this loves you. But in fact, our first speaker is going to be Sarah Hackford. Sarah is a co-leader of the Biomaterialities Research Group at Humboldt University in Berlin. Her research spans many aspects of the bioeconomy, including a political project to transition the economy away from fossil fuels and towards bio-based resources. It also includes the social and political implications of technologies, feminist perspectives, and sustainability. Sarah, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Pat. I will share my, oh no, that's wrong. Share my screen, or I'm trying to do it before I start. Okay. Can you see my slides? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so yes, hi again, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here virtually, at least. Thanks a lot to Pat and Ames for the invitation. I speak to you as a social science researcher today, working for a few years now on sustainability issues, on the political ecology of food and agriculture. And I also worked on technology assessment in the past, which is why in my current research, I'm in particular looking at the role of technologies in sustainable food systems. And I've been asked not to talk about genome editing so much, but about broader questions of sustainability and my work. And this is why today I will share some insights from my research on the role of the digital transformation in sustainable food systems. And I will specifically look at the nexus of sustainability, digital technology, and corporate lock-ins. And in my view, this is important because we see some recurrent mechanisms in the nexus of technology and corporate power in the food system over history. And of course, as Pat already illustrated, there are many factors that shape sustainability. But technologies have always played an important role in shaping the food system historically. And they have always worked as promissory narratives for fixing structural problems. And here, of course, GMOs are the most prominent example, I would say. And you all probably know that the inventions of GMO might have led to higher yields in some parts of the world. However, it has also increased the privatization of seeds through patents and the dependencies of farmers from large corporations. And it has also led to a massive increase in herbicide applications. And against this background of technological change, in my project, we have looked at the digital transformation that has made its way into the food system more recently. And we have analyzed how corporate actors picture sustainability in that context and what kind of solutions they propose and develop. And not surprisingly, in the vision of most large corporations like Bayer, BASF, John Deere, you name it, digital products such as big data-based predictions and recommendations for seeding, agricultural platforms for farm management, smart land machines, these are means to make the food system more sustainable. And the digital transformation and the so-called precision agriculture is seen as a win-win strategy that will benefit the environment, farmers, and consumers alike. And to critically interrogate this claim, we looked a bit closer at a number of platforms, technologies, and services of large agriculture firms. And there we could see that, as with the digital economy in general, this transformation is characterized by monopoly structures, network effects, and the concentration of corporate power. And this is illustrated by the fact that in many countries with industrialized food and biomass production, precision agriculture is dominated by large agribusiness and agri-tech firms, such as Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, and those that I mentioned. And these firms predominantly shape the development of precision technologies. And by looking closer, we found that many firms use specific lock-ins to maintain their control and market positions, and these lock-ins perpetuate existing dependencies of farmers from their products. For instance, there are technological and data lock-ins built into land machines or also built into software applications and farm management platforms. And these lock-ins make it harder for farmers to freely choose equipment according to their needs and to switch tools, so that they often remain in the technical economic ecosystem of a company. And furthermore, since agriculture data is becoming an increasingly important asset in that field, companies use digital platforms and legal mechanisms such as license agreements or data privacy policies to secure their effective control and use of farm data. And we also found what I called systemic lock-ins, which refers to the fact that the firms develop solutions which are specifically tailored to the needs of their own agro-industrial production model. In fact, most platforms or robots are designed for large-scale and capital-intensive agriculture with industrialized production of monocrops on large square fields with only little diversity. And this means that these tools, based on these current patterns, reproduce the agro-industrial system, which is not sustainable at all, as we all know. And lastly, we also identified what we call discursive lock-ins. And this refers to dominant sustainability narratives that are linked to these technologies. And this narrative goes, precision farming will make existing models of agriculture more efficient because it makes them more precise and more sustainable, hence in the future. For example, more precision by using variable rate technologies that would allow fertilizers and pesticides to be applied more accurately. In other words, it's about incremental improvements. In fact, the claimed benefits here are mostly based on scanty data and future expectations and models, much more than on empirical evidence. There's actually not much data that really shows significant empirical environmental gains through these precision agriculture tools. And this is why I see here a renaissance, I would say, of the technological fix, and I called it digital fix in one of my papers. And I would argue that through this emphasis of digital technologies as legitimate solutions, it becomes much more difficult for other approaches to sustainability to gain a hearing. Approaches which are less technology-centered, as for instance, agroecological practices. And against this background of this power, technology, and lock-in nexus, I would highlight just 3 points, which in my view are, of course, not sufficient, but crucial for sustainable food systems. And this is first, the fact that technology is never neutral. It always has political implications, as we have learned from GMOs. And considering that, we need more innovations that serve the needs of also small-scale farms, of agroecology and organic farming, and the ideas of food and technology sovereignty. And second, in finding solutions, we need to go beyond technology and broaden our understanding of sustainability. And I say that because despite long-standing criticism, particularly in the social sciences, but also across disciplines, long-standing criticism of technological fixes, I still see much of policy and science centering around technological solutions. And instead, I think we need to understand sustainability as based on practices towards more social justice and diversity. And Pat, you already mentioned diversity, and I think this also includes less concentration and more diversity of crops, of farming system, but also of actors. And Jennifer Klepp, for instance, has illustrated this so convincingly in her writings and her work. And third, and as a last point, for these things to become reality, we need to limit corporate power. The agri-food system is highly concentrated, and this trend is continuing. And we know on the input side, a few agrochemical companies dominate the markets, and downstream the chain, it's a handful of large supermarkets and retailers that dictate prices to producers and consumers. And here in this setting, it is important to note that corporate power is based not only on these high market shares, but additionally, it's also based on the control of infrastructure, data, and information. And we therefore need much more stricter and more effective policies and laws to regulate vertical integration and mergers and acquisitions to limit corporate power concentration. In sum, we need policies that better account for the nexus of technology and corporate power in the food system. And these are my main points that I wanted to share with you in the beginning. And I think that in the further discussion now, we will be able to draw many links to the topic of genome editing, because this is what I mentioned in the beginning. I see some recurrent patterns here that we know from the earlier generations of GMOs that we now observe with regards to digital agriculture, and that we can probably see with the development of genome editing as well. And having said that, I thank you very much and stop my screen sharing. I hope I was in time.
Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much. And really interesting, and picks up a lot of things which I know we can talk through in the discussion and the Q&A. So thank you very much, Sarah. Next up is Angelika Hilbeck. Angelika was a co-founder of the European Network of Scientists for Social and Environmental Responsibility, ENSER, and Critical Scientists of Switzerland. She has recently retired from her work at the Department of Environmental System Science at ETH in Zurich, where she was researching and teaching about the environmental biosafety of genetically modified plants within ecosystems, but still very active in all these things. And we welcome you.
Thank you very much, Pat. You see my slides and you hear me, right? If I don't get another feedback, I presume this is a yes. Okay, good. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the invitation. Lovely opportunity to share some of my experience and thoughts on genetic engineering and sustainability. And as you might expect, they will be somewhat different. And part of it, it connects directly to what you have said earlier, Pat. You know, sustainability, there is no definition of what that is, or there is as many definitions out there as there's groups of people who can agree on one from their particular discipline and make of it what they wish. So I did, as a little exercise, also in preparation for this talk, I just punched in 3 words into Google in order to see what would come up if biotechnology, genetic engineering, and sustainability would come up. And this is what I found. You get endless, limitless publications and articles and opinion pieces where biotechnology solutions for sustainable tomorrow or for sustainable enhanced whatever you have, fill in the gaps, role of sustainable biotechnology, even the invention of new terminologies, sustainable development in biotechnology, also fill in the blanks, genetic engineering serves sustainability, and biotechnology and climate change with, various fallouts it can have from the government, genetic engineering, sustainable crop disease fighting, etc., genetic modification associated with sustainability aspects, and on it goes. So there is no shortage in the biotech field to postulate, describe, and situate their product developments, their research, and all of that in the realm of sustainability, of how they think of sustainability. However, what all of them have in common when they come from the genetic engineering and the biotech side is there's usually no analysis regarding the causes and reasons for the problems they want to solve. Hence, since there is no cause and reason analysis, none of their tech solutions addresses these root causes, let alone document with independent data how that tech solution does alleviate the causes and not simply shift or add problems to it or shift them to another field where it's out of sight. Most of them, certainly those that come from a corporate background, keep up with the old linear, extractivist, reductionist, capitalist industry model intact. That's what they want, basically misleading the world into believing they can fix the problems without addressing nor understanding their root causes, using the same recipes and mindsets that created these problems in the first place. However, in addition to that, this is my perspective from researching this field for 30 years, if not longer. All of these gene technologies, and it doesn't matter what name you give it, as whether you use it with scissors and scalpels and whatever you want to call them, all gene technologies rest and have to take some leaps of faith. And I call it faith. It's a belief system. And that rests on reductionistic, mechanistic assumptions of the atomistic behavior of specific DNA sequences called genes. These genes are associated or claimed to be associated with certain functions and meaning. They are equated, therefore, with code, just as in the IT sector of electromechanical engineering. All organisms are logically, coherently in this faith group believed to be nothing more than the sum of the DNA-coded parts, pretty much like computers, and that these DNA codes can be moved at will from one biological context to another without changing the meaning, hence the function of the gene, where context is irrelevant. And that applies also if you just delete, reverse, or whatever you do there. Context is irrelevant, will not affect anything else in the organism, and it is all under full human control. They know what they're doing. Of course, this is scientific nonsense. None of that is true, and much of it is hubris. Because genes are anything but without context. Genes, in fact, operate exclusively in context. Context is the quintessential requirement for genes to unfold any function, any meaning, any processing they can do. And they are contingent on interactions. So none of it works in isolation. None of it works in a reductionistic manner. None of it works in an additive manner. Very, very rarely you might find that in highly stable, highly artificial lab conditions that humans have created. But as soon as you go out there and you're working within an environment and all its interactions and all its variability, that breaks down usually. This is just an interaction network of thousands of genes in one of the most primitive organisms we know, the yeast cells. Okay, and now just hang on for a second. My thing was disappeared. This is a publication where people just studied the drought responsive genes in just one variety of maize and found 174 responsive genes that co-expressed and interact in their networks, in highly connected, interconnected networks. That would, if you change any of these genes, that's what this means. The question isn't no longer if there will be knock-on effects and interaction effects. They will be, that's 100% guaranteed. The question is only which ones, and will they matter, and what will they be? And we don't understand that, okay? Now I have a bit of a trouble here. So all gene technology interactions are interventions at a level of interaction that we don't understand, regardless what space you use, what tool you use, and how precise you think your tools are. It's independent of the tools, no matter how precise they are. They are placed outside of the multidimensional choreography of evolution of life forms And more importantly, they're outside of our understanding of these various dimensions of evolution. And what makes them really risky is that in the engineering field, in the biotech field, it is not even considered to be a quintessential precondition that is necessary for interfering and intervening into these complexities of gene by environment interactions. And that is what makes it quite risky. All right. You know something about a tiny little bit, maybe one of these genes, but you don't understand the context you're changing in it. And this is, in my opinion, the reason why biotechnology has largely failed, or gene technology definitely, to deliver any of the products they have been claiming for 50 years. You must keep in mind, biotechnology, genetic engineering started in the early 70s when the first transfer of DNA was successfully done and was shown the proof of principle. Ever since then, we hear the same promises and the same claims that we're hearing today, regardless. So since 50 years, it's been promised to make significant, measurable, sustainable contributions to the big problems of humanity. And since then, it has failed to do that. It has delivered what you see here, two trait categories, herbicide resistant and BT, in 4 commodity crops, uniform, standardized in deserts of landscapes. That's the old technologies, and the newer technologies, in my view, have even failed more spectacularly to deliver because they are out there. Some of them, the older ones, are out there since the last century. And even the newer one, the CRISPR, for example, is out there since over a decade and counting. And there has hardly been anything on the market in tangible manifest products that you can go in a shop and buy. And those who have been tend to disappear quite quickly. This is, for example, one of the 2 examples where indeed manifest products for farmers to go in a seed shop and buy have been put on the market. One is the Cybus herbicide-tolerant oilseed rape, created by ODM, not by CRISPR, ODM. It's an old technology. They were put out with a lot of fanfare in 2019 on the market, and they were promised that new ones will be delivered that include all kinds of other traits, pot shattering tolerance, tolerance to multiple herbicides, and resistance to diseases. Of course, a few years later, nothing was be seen. Those varieties, the Falco brands, have disappeared. They're not there anymore. The other company, Calix, for example, that produced manifest seeds for farmers in the shops, created by Talens, barely made it 2 years, and then they were pulled from the market with this statement published that the company has disappointed investors with delayed product launches and slow growth, which contradicts its business models that rest on claims of speedy development cycle of novel gene editing technologies. Leaving aside that Talens is not a novel gene editing technology, but almost as old as there is transgenesis. Now these 2 companies have merged, okay? Calix went broke, Cybus basically picked it up and created the Precision Gene Editing and Trait Licensing Company, meaning they've moved out of that business and moved behind it, where the process is now the moneymaker. They've invented the trait machine where they put together DNA sequences. So it's a sequence crunching machine and a sequence putting together machine with constructs where they assign certain functions and meaning to, get IP protection of it and license it to their new customers, which are seed companies, as they post on their own website here. We're not a seed company, and I add anymore. They used to be. Our business is to work with seed companies, large breeding organizations who will use their licensed traits. And the trait model is a central vision in this. Now, the problem is that even that didn't work. Since this year, they are under scrutiny for fraud. There has been a report that has had quite some consequences on that market, where Cybus has come under scrutiny where research outfits for investors have found there's no evidence that Cybus gene editing technology brings desirable new crops to the market. Instead, they found farmers' complaints that is still to the former seeds they had of lower crop yields and lost revenues, along with a multitude of examples of large seed manufacturers and distributors walking away from the joint venture partnership with Cybus. We think investors have been duped into believing a promotional management team about an overhyped technology previously tried, tested, and failed by some of the world's largest seed manufacturers and distributors. That hardly sounds like a resounding success. There are now class action lawsuit firms who are jumping on that bandwagon, are trying to get investors to join them to sue Cybus. My prediction is Cybus will not exist much longer.
Angelica, we're going to need you to wrap up soon.
Exactly. So I'm going to skip this one application. This is also something that is supposedly on the market, a non-pungent mustard that they actually took the health benefit away by taking away the flavors and the mustard, what makes up mustard seeds, and still claim that this is a compelling path towards improving human nutrition. While indeed they took away myrosinase, a quintessential enzyme in bringing glucosinolates into a health benefit for humans and for the plant. It's a powerful plant defense compound, which is now gone, and a powerful health benefit, for example, for reducing cancers, etc. So people have to go now to health food shops and buy themselves still the pungent ones. If that works, I predict it's not going to be long on the market either. My last slide, Pat, we see a shift in the business models. While we were, and I was in it from the get-go, older GE technologies delivered IP-protected GM products for end users and farmers. Like whether we liked it or not, there were out herbicide-tolerant Roundup-ready crops, there were out BT crops on millions of acres, not more. Those were the two traits, but they were out there. They're there to this very day. You can go in a shop, you can buy them, an end user can buy them. With these newer GE tech focus is the process, and the profits are largely made, that I've showed you illustratively with Cybus and colleagues who learned that lesson, getting out of that seed and product development business and getting into the engineering process, developing tools, constructs, sequencing, etc., all the technical equipment you need for it. But products are claimed and promised. That's why the investment is made, but they don't need to be delivered, apparently, or until today. Maybe now, when investors are starting to see that the return on their investments in all of these tools is not coming back to them, we might start seeing more of these lawsuits. But so far for now, you can claim what you want. You don't have to deliver. What we see on the market are products like non-browning, non-pungent, faking freshness, creating tasteless foods, or if it comes to products, it's herbicide-tolerant plants. Everything else is still in the trial. There's thousands of trials, thousands of them out there. I'm fully aware of that. But to the market in 12 plus years, this is what came to the market and disappeared. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelica. That was very powerful. It's stimulated a lot of questions, and of course, everybody's free to either post their names or anonymously. But it's interesting how many anonymous questions there are, folks out there. If you believe in what you're saying, maybe put your name to it. Now, our next speaker is Nick Lampkin. Nick is an old colleague of mine. Nick has spent actually 4 decades researching organic farming and food systems, including technical, environmental, business, and policy aspects around that. He is currently a researcher and product coordinator at the Thunen Institute for Farm Economics in Germany, where he is working on indicators to reward environmental policy outcomes and on the implications of the EU's 25% target for organic farming. Nick, we're very pleased to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, I need to share my presentation, which I should have got ready. I hope you can see that okay. Yeah, so I feel a bit challenged after the last two presentations in terms of the specialist knowledge around GM and GM products. My role is more in the agricultural side of things and in farming systems. But I think there are a certain number of issues that overlap, and I hope to be able to pick those up now. So the issue of sustainability definitions has been raised and is clearly a problem. We often think of it as in terms of the social, economic, and environmental sustainability, because the early commentators used that definition. But clearly, we get into a situation that sustainability is multifunctional in its approach. I could add governance in, or I could take social and economic as one group and put socioeconomic, and each time that affects the weighting that you give to environment within the overall framework of sustainability. So even that, this issue of weighting is a problem. The second issue that I highlight with that is, given that there are lots of different functions that sustainability normally picks up, is that there are often trade-offs between different elements within the sustainability definition. So there is no perfect sustainable system or sustainable technology that we can come up with, because we're always going to face these issues of trade-offs and different weightings. And I think it is much more realistic to think about sustainability in relative terms, so whether we're making an improvement in sustainability, and to think about it as an incremental process for getting things better. There's also a need, of course, to distinguish public and private benefits. A lot of public goods like soil protection, climate, and so on are highly relevant within the sustainability context, but often farmers will emphasize the needs to maintain their financial viability, and that to an extent is a more private consideration within the overall process. And we have over the years seen many attempts to develop sustainability assessment frameworks for agriculture that could be relevant in terms of this current debate. But actually you need to think about this in different levels. It might be at the personal or individual business system development level. It might be in terms of business to business communication. So for example, retailers or processors being able to know about the products that they're buying from individual farmers. It might be for consumer information, so the consumers could know more. The whole debate around the eco score and the planet score labeling at the moment is a very relevant case. And equally, it could be used for policy delivery, where we're trying to assess how well individual farmers or individual businesses are contributing to policy goals. Just a moment. So sorry. I think the key thing then is to think about technology assessment, and the emphasis has been made already about GMs being technologies. We could also be thinking about herbicides in that context, like Roundup, or we could be thinking about nuclear technologies. It doesn't really matter. I think that for me, one of the key issues here is that often people who are critical of individual technologies is referred to as anti-science. And I think we often use science and technology in the same breath, but actually that they're different. And we need science to provide the knowledge about how things work and how things function, and we need to provide the evidence for some of the assessments we make. But what we're talking about in practice is actually the assessment of technologies rather than the issue of science as such. Technology assessment needs to consider a whole range of issues, public health, environmental, but it might also be, as was already indicated in a previous presentation, cultural, social, or economic aspects. But it's clear that whatever we look at in terms of technology, it has to cover both the costs and the benefits. And I think as part of the current debate, the discussion about whether we should focus on risk assessment for assessing novel breeding techniques, or whether we should look at sustainability assessment, it's not an either-or situation. They both have to be part of the overall framework. Then I think the other issue that is highly relevant here is whether we're looking at the sustainability of individual technologies or whether we look at the overall sustainability of systems. There is a nice framework developed by some Canadian researchers 30 odd years ago, the Efficiency, Substitution and Redesign Framework, looking at innovations in agriculture that initially people focus on trying to make things more efficient, in terms of making input use more efficient. Perhaps we could argue that precision agriculture also comes into this framework to an extent. Then you could be looking at substitution, where you're trying to replace certain inputs with other more benign ones, or you're replacing old technologies, the nice picture of an old tractor earlier, with more effective ones through technological innovation. Or you're looking at adopting a systems management approach which aims to actually reduce the problems that you're trying to solve in the first place. And I would refer to that in terms of ecological innovation as opposed to technological innovation. Often the agroecology movement will talk about that also as agroecology. But the issue for me is that the increasing complexity and multifunctionality as you go down this sequence requires appropriate methods of impact assessment. And there's a real question about whether focusing just on the efficiency or the technology aspects really picks up all of the factors. And I think the gene environment interactions that we were hearing about just now are also relevant in that context. But I'm going to use a completely different example to illustrate this. It's the use of tillage within farming systems and the effect of that on soil carbon matter. So we have two technologies that are often contrasted, zero tillage using herbicides like Roundup versus reduced tillage in an organic system with legumes in the rotation. And we know from research that both have got the potential to enhance soil biodiversity, particularly in terms of earthworms and organic matter or carbon levels over period. But to make the assessment, you have to look at the whole system. You can't just look at individual crops, because the organic system with the legumes in the rotation only functions if you take the whole of the rotation into consideration. And the second aspect is that any technology, and in this case, the legumes that are being used, have other effects that are also relevant. And in terms of multifunctionality, that becomes relevant. So while legumes will contribute to building up organic matter in the soil, and possibly to carbon sequestration, they also affect other aspects of soil fertility, such as structure and aggregate stability, water infiltration and reduction of erosion risk. They have a big impact on biodiversity, but they also contribute to replacing nitrogen fertilizers with biological nitrogen fixation, which is a really important means of reducing emissions within agricultural systems. So you begin to have a much wider range of impacts when you start looking at the system level. In looking at sustainability assessment, it's clear we've got a number of different things here, multi-purpose, so that we've got the different levels that I've already mentioned that we can think about. We need to be clear about what goals and outputs we want to focus on. Quite often people focus on water, soil, biodiversity, climate, air quality, and issues like that, but food security, public health, animal welfare, public and private sector governance, all of these things can come in as quite relevant issues within that framework. We need to be clear about what boundaries we're using for what we're assessing. So it might be individual technologies or practices, or it might be individual farm systems, or it could be looking at the wider local or regional or global systems. And to do that, we need to find appropriate indicators. They need to be meaningful, which means that they're close to the problem. They need to be evidence-based, so that there is a science underpinning for what is happening. And they need to be legally defensible, because if you start to apply them in a strict way, then that has financial impacts for individuals and businesses. But the data availability issues and the transaction costs might be so high that there are compromises involved. So that discussion needs to be had. And I show this slide. It's very complex, but I'm not intending to go through every single detail on this. It's showing you some of the outputs that are relevant that we're trying to achieve with soil, water, climate, and biodiversity, and some of the indicators that you can use in that context. And the fact that we've got different levels at which we can work. So it's quite easy in the European farming situation, but also in the UK, to think about the IACs or the technical coefficients that are readily used in policy support systems. And every farmer delivers this data to government pretty much, so we can use this first column of indicators in that context very easily. A second approach that we can use is in relation to production standards. So the organic certification systems have been focused around a certain number of these, avoiding certain inputs and achieving some contributions to sustainability in that context. Getting closer to the actual problem that we're trying to identify would be calculating things like nutrient budgets, surpluses of nitrogen or phosphorus in the system, pesticide loads to be more exact. They begin to require more data, and because of the budgeting and calculation frameworks involved, become more complex. So, for example, we have recently had a report from DEFRA in the UK looking at carbon tools and finding that they're really, at the moment, it's very difficult to get a consistent view from those. The last one is doing direct measurements in the field, which is the most expensive route to do that. I promised Pat that I would keep to time, and I failed miserably, but I'm going to finish on this slide here, which is the open questions. So there are a lot of social and political issues involved even in these processes. So who chooses which are the appropriate outcomes and indicators to focus on? What is the right level at which to base the assessment? I mentioned that already. How do you weight or value the achievement of individual indicators? So if a farmer manages to get 10 out of 10 on one indicator, and another farmer gets 1 out of 10 on 10 indicators, which is more valuable? And is it possible that we can measure consistency or progression over time within these sorts of frameworks? I haven't got you any ready answers on a plate, but I think now is the time that we need to start looking critically at all of the sustainability assessment frameworks we have, and looking at whether some of them can be brought together into a more consistent and coherent pattern. Thank you.
Nick, thank you so much for that. I think it really brings home the complexity of trying to pull together a sustainability metric. I'd like us to go, because we're running out of time, straight to the Q&A, but I do have a question for you, if I may, about your work on, if you can answer it briefly, about your work on the EU's goal to have 25% organic, and what are the implications for that on sustainability?
Yeah, this is where these sorts of indicators do become important, because quite often policies are made without taking account of what are the big impacts. So we know, for example, that a 25% increase will result in a substantial reduction in the use of nitrogen fertilizer on that land. About 25-26% overall on that 25% area. That's 2.7 million tons. That has quite significant impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. And you need to bear in mind, for example, that nitrogen fertilizer manufacture accounts for about half of the energy use in agriculture, as well as accounting for a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're having quite major impacts through that change. So that looking then on, we also see changes and reductions in livestock production, and increased use of the legume layers that are talked about within the rotations. Those factors together reduce nitrogen, reduce livestock, and more temporary layers and grassland within arable rotations, result in a reduction of about 50% in the greenhouse gas emissions per hectare that you would get on land converted to organic farming. The challenge, and again, this illustrates trade-offs, is that organic farming is associated with lower yields. And that is obviously a critical issue if you're thinking about food security also as one of the relevant factors in sustainability. But when we consider that in the EU, nearly 2/3 of the grain produced is grown to feed to animals, and actually reducing animal consumption, reducing the production of animals, reduces the demand for grain, and therefore some of the yield loss, if not all of the yield loss, can be mitigated through that loop. And it illustrates, from my point of view, the need to define the boundaries of your systems when you're doing sustainability assessment quite broadly in order to pick up all of the relevant issues.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, all of you have left me with tons of questions, and there are tons of questions in the Q&A as well. So first of all, I'm going to switch us back to gallery view, because what I would like to do is go straight to the Q&A, but just make an observation before we do about what I've heard from all of you. There's a thread running through all of this, and that is that sustainability solutions seem to be picked up and applied without actually really thinking about what their implications are further down the line. And that seems to apply to regulation and politics and business models and what have you. We are grasping at things without necessarily applying any foresight, which I think could be detrimental as we move forward. Ames, I'm going to hand over to you to start the Q&A. There are some interesting questions there.
Thank you, Pat. Yes, we've had a lot of questions come in, so thank you, everybody. We'll get through as many as we can in the time we've got left. I'll start with one that came in quite early in response to something you said, Pat, about genetic integrity being part of sustainability. So the question's from Anonymous. How is genetic integrity to be understood with regard to the natural variation in genomes due to mutations occurring naturally? What distinguishes those natural changes from gene editing? Open to anyone who wants to answer. Pat, you're on mute.
Thanks, Ames. So I certainly hope our panelists will pick this up, but just to say that it's a question that's predicated on this idea that gene editing can't be detected, and that is a false presumption. It can be detected, we can develop it, but that depends on transparency, and we have not yet got the transparency in our system to know, for instance, when a gene-edited product is being produced, what genetic changes we should be looking for. Having that transparency will make it much easier to detect. And I'll leave it to Nick and Angelica and Sarah to maybe pick up the scientific aspects of the difference between the sort of innate genetic functionality and what comes from gene editing or GMOs.
If I can chip in here, because I hear that argument often, is it resonates or is predicated exactly on my entry remarks. If you look at an organism that's just a linear added a product of the sum of its parts coded by DNA, then it wouldn't matter. But if you do not share and understand that that is how ecology and the planet works and life works, you understand that the ground rules within which changes and diversity and variation and mutation and testing and probing whether a mutation works or functions or not works within a much larger context that we don't understand to its fullest. Of course, we understand parts of it. We understand enough to know that it's out there. But that's where change and adaptation and the interaction and that eventually, precipitates to a DNA level takes place. So you cannot just play God and just play around with things. That's not what happens. It follows rules, okay? It's a rules-based variation generation, and it's along boundaries, clear boundaries that are flexible. Of course, life has always to be flexible. There's nothing written in stone there, but there is larger rules. There is compartments, there is barriers, there is, obstacles. Not everybody can, every organism can exchange DNA material with everybody, with every other organism, etc. And it's these boundaries within which evolution takes place that shaped and shapes diversity and shapes organisms that are produced and exist in the environment. That's a completely different process than when you sit in a lab, in a highly artificial environment, in a highly controlled environment, and you're manipulating individual nucleotide sequences without understanding the full context of it. You just know something about the particular sequence you're working with that have knowledge about, but what the role, function, meaning of it is in the entirety of the genome, of the cell, of the organism, of the environment, you don't know. And that is what makes it, when I said makes it risky, is if you manipulate things and engineer things you don't understand in its breadth and fully, you're going about it blindly, basically, or with a little, that's why I use the torchlight, just with a little torchlight on a little part that you know and understand, and the rest you don't understand, the chances that something comes out of that kind of an exercise that is a well thought through, well adapted, well functioning organism is actually pretty small. But the chances that something comes out that might work on a particular level, but when you release it into the grand scheme of things, will do something completely else, or take on emerging properties that come from that manipulation, you have absolutely no idea about what's being done there and what this can take on. And that's a big difference between cutting and splicing different DNA nucleotide sequences is the maximum reduction. And, it's a completely different process, fundamentally completely different than what evolution does, working within context and boundaries.
Okay, so if I may just interject, because we have a lot of questions to get through, but we've had a complaint from the attendees who say that this is a one-sided exercise and that all of you seem to be anti-GM. Are you all anti-GM? It was an anonymous complaint, so I can't attribute it to anybody.
I don't know what anti-GM is. I'm science, I'm pro-science, and I follow the science. If the science leads me to dead ends, I name them. So the tools that are being used in genetic engineering biotechnology can be elegant tools of studying the grander questions, for example, but you must be aware and you must be interested in those grander questions that you want to elucidate, the fundamental processes and working, and the role of DNA and genes in organisms in conjunction and in interaction with the environment. That fascinating research, but there's hardly any money going in there because it doesn't come with a business model. It doesn't come with promissory promises of saving something or solving something without addressing the root causes again. And just, running on hope. And that has not worked. It's just something we need to understand. It has not delivered. And we have to go over the books and look in why has it not delivered. It wasn't because of money. There is astronomical sums of money went into this field and continue to go into the field. It's not because of lack of political support or of regulations. Okay.
Thank you, Angelica. I'm going to bring Sarah in on that one now. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something on Angelica's point. I mean, I'm definitely not an expert on this natural science part, but what I see missing also largely in the debate on sustainability is these questions of justice and property rights, for instance. And this is something we saw that with older, earlier generation GM, I always say NGO, this is GMOs, of course. And what we now can see with regards to newer technology, again, that this question of patents, I think it's still not solved. And I mean, the question of who owns technologies and who actually benefits from technologies and who bears the costs. I mean, these are questions which are crucial in my view. And this is not about being against the technology, but about being critically assessing technological change over history. And I think this is a very important issue to raise. And just maybe very briefly with regards to what I'm researching right now, this question of data and who owns data in the food system, we see again that there are certain questions of who controls data and who has data sovereignty. It's not the farmers. It's actually a legal gap. There's no regulation. I mean, farm data is not protected by the GDPR regulation in the European Union, and even less so in other regions of the world. So there's really kind of a gap. And that's why I said earlier, I see some parallels of technological change looking at precision agriculture or precision breeding. And this would be my answer to, I'm not like pro or against, but I would say there is a lot not solved yet, and much has to do with justice and distribution of benefits. And there also, I think genome editing has to deliver. And I'm skeptical, like Angelica, that it will deliver also with regards to these issues. That would be my answer to that.
Thank you, Sarah. Which leads quite nicely onto a question that's come in for you, actually, from someone who works in shaping markets. The question is regarding the corporate power. How would you propose that small-scale farmers or other actors in the market aim to take back this power? Does it need to be government-led, or can you think networks of actors in the system can change the institutional norms currently seen?
I try to make it brief. When we see lots of innovations coming from grassroots movements like coalitions of farmers and coders and hackers, it's very interesting to study these innovations. We know FarmHack, for instance, who developed an open source platform for farmers who tried to break with these proprietary mechanisms of closed techno-economic systems. And we know other examples. Also in Germany, there are some smaller field robots for agroecology or permaculture and these kind of things. But they have a hard time to let's say to grow. They're still in the niche. And this is also because it's hard to compete with corporate solutions where a lot of money and capital is in the background. And that's why my answer would be, yeah, we need these like grassroots innovation, but we also need political regulation that supports alternatives and that strengthens certain sovereignty and rights over, for instance, data or other property, intellectual property, which is not necessarily in the sense of, as it has been before, like protecting corporate intellectual property, because that's what it's actually the case right now. Yeah, I mean, I can speak about these agriculture innovations. And actually, I had a question to Angelica. If she sees any option of emancipatory use of genome editing, or if it's so, I mean, is there any similarity between what I've just mentioned briefly about, okay, there are emancipatory grassroots innovation. Is this even thinkable with genome editing? Is there any way of doing it like in an emancipatory, useful way?
There have been people who tried. There's also a hacker community that was doing genetic hacks, or maybe still does, I don't know. But if you listen to what I tried to say, you understand that this is a very different field. We're dealing with life and with processes and functions that we don't understand yet to the extent that, in my view, is necessary if you want to apply a intentional design on it. Okay, life is nothing we invented. Everything AI, everything technical, everything of that is human invented fully. There may not be a single human anymore on planet Earth who understands full what's going on in AI, but it is or has been created by humans. And it is, by comparison with life, with the planetary processes that are going on out there, simple, okay? So it is I question and put into question and challenge that it is feasible to do this at that level of understanding we have, and with that lack of a culture of understanding our limitations and keeping them in mind when starting to engineer. You know, I've been in this field long enough to understand what the philosophy and the mindset is in the field. Risk, safety, complexity, interactions, you know, looking far beyond the little DNA sequence, you know, in that particular context you're working in, is rarely existing. And those who understand it exists and try to bring it in, I know multiple people of that left the field because they weren't, that kind of thinking wasn't welcome or was in any way, you know, generating income. So no, I don't think there is an emancipatory level as long as it is pushed with the underpinning narrative right now of this maximally reductionistic view of how organisms work. How can you emancipate yourself in this? You know, an emancipated view of a failed reductionistic concept? I don't think that exists. That's a bit, you know, nonsensical in my view. But there's people who don't share that, so maybe they can think of something. So maybe you should be asking somebody else.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Nick in next. We've had a question about your point about trade-offs in sustainable food systems. The question, if we are to approach, or if we are to approach capability to create sustainable food systems, will that inevitably mean matching food production in different geographies or environments with local ecology? So essentially fine-tuning food production systems with local ecology. So that would mean what works in one place would differ from what works in another, in contrast to corporate agribusiness notions that one size fits all.
Yeah, there's some interesting points coming through the discussion at the moment, and I think this is one of the challenges. If you take a view that a systems approach with the redesign emphasis is the relevant one to be thinking about, an ecological innovation approach, which is a view I take, then it is something that requires local solutions to fit local ecologies. And it's not possible to come up with a one-size-fits-all agricultural system that you can then implement in every part of the world. I think you definitely have to find systems that are adapted to different climates, different soils, and so on, and different actual economic situations as well, and legal situations, because clearly you've got a big contrast between resource-poor farmers working in some parts of the world and resource-rich farmers having access to technologies and inputs that allow them to be, I hesitate to say more efficient, but certainly to be productive in a way that maybe some of the resource-poor farmers find it difficult to be. So I think there's definitely a requirement for that. And the challenge then is to then also think about, you know, I talked about certain indicator sets which have been developed within a European framework. You might well have other indicator sets that might be used for sustainability assessment in different situations to reflect the realities of those situations.
Thank you. A question for all of you now, from somebody from Lyon, who had a conversation with an undergraduate ecology student in the UK and discovered they were being taught about the benefits of gene editing with no attempt at critical analysis. Given the number of educational institutions that are developing products and processes using genetic technologies, what can be done, and have there been any initiatives so far to ensure universities are developing courses that are balanced and responsible? Who would like to start on that one?
That would probably be me again, because I've been trying to get this into the academia all my life and was actively contributing myself. So I can say, as long as for our environmental system science students at ETH, they at least heard at least once in their undergraduate studies something about risks and biosafety issues of genetically modified crops and plants. But of course, that is far too little to explain everything and have it on even eyesight with, of course, the overwhelming message that's coming out of all the biotech departments. And I'm afraid this is going to stay like that, because you get what you pay for, is what the American saying is. If you invest millions and billions into creating thousands and thousands of departments of biotechnology, genetic engineering, molecular genetics, that there is all shared. That one particular view of how genes work, of DNA, RNA, all that understanding of it is taught. And as long as that is there, and there's just maybe a few others who are out there who point to the science and say, look, that's not true. It doesn't work like this. Maybe in very, very exceptional cases, you will be the single voice out there where they will say, oh, look, it's just a few people out there. They're, don't take them serious. Don't follow them. They are there. We're trying to give, the positions and the understandings of ecology, evolution, a voice, and explaining it and pointing to the science that says you cannot. The reductionism doesn't apply. And this is why this field fails. It's not because of any external reasons. The products are not coming forward because the science is wrong. And there's not enough science attention paid to the scientific foundations on which this entire enterprise, public or private, is resting. As long as that is the case, I'm afraid your ecology students in your university will hear only from those that have a paid position there, and that's biotechnologists. And they will not confront you with the issues and the science and the questions we're confronting you with.
Ames, could I just pop in here? There's I'm looking at the Q&A, and there's a follow-up question that might work with this that you all might be able to answer, from Craig Lewis. Thank you, Craig, for putting your name on your question. To the point that Angelica is making on the need to understand consequences, I wonder, how does this fit with the long-established use of mutagenesis methods in plant breeding, where random structural changes are done and new variations established, and then these products are used in the food system? So first of all, my understanding, Craig, is that the use of mutagenesis in plants had its heyday in the 1970s, and very few people are using it now. But I take your point, and maybe the panel can answer more fully.
Well, within your response lays the other response also. Why is it that it had its heydays? Because it didn't really work either. These methods were used in desperation. And again, you have to look at the larger context within which such technologies were born and out of what mindset they came. It is a consequence that we have impoverished ourselves in the agroecosystems, or in agriculture and gardening, whatever, of the necessary diversity at the gene level, at the genome level, at the organism level, to the degree where breeders who were desperately looking for genetic material they can work with in order to improve and continue to adapt their varieties to make them, adapted to the challenges that continue to evolve in environments as well, they didn't find the necessary genetic diversity anymore in their gene pools. And out of sheer desperation to tickle out the little last bit of diversity that might still be hidden somewhere in the genome, they zapped it with UV light or with radiation and with colchicine and toxins, whatever, in order to get to split up a diversity. But most of them were freaks. Hardly any of them was successful, were traits or organisms and varieties lines they could work with. So it was really in desperate cases where there was basically no genetic diversity anymore available, where they started to use these methods, and also they were not very successful. That's why the heydays or gone. But there are some products of this out there. And then again, you have to say also those were limited to the boundaries and the rules within those plants, okay? It wasn't that you were going into this and manipulating individual genes. And what you can do now, and one of my slides was showing it with the mustard, for example, that I could just briefly brush over, they deleted and knocked out those genes for myrosinase production on all 4 sets of of chromosomes they had, all 4. That is impossible with undirected mutagenesis. You just zap the genome and the genes with it, and you have to take what you get. Okay, and the chances that you knock out one particular stretch of genes on a tetraploid organism, you know, that has a tetraploid genome set, it's near nil. Okay, so that is what this technology can, what even if you zap it with the UV light or with whatever mutagenesis you cannot achieve. And I am not a fan of that, just to make that clear.
Thank you. We're very nearly out of time, so I'd just like to ask one final question and then we'll wrap up. This is from Siguna. I hope I pronounced that right. It was for Angelica, but I'd actually like to ask it to Sarah, if I may. What would you say to those who argue that all possible interactions, even those currently outside human understanding, will be grasped and understood by AI? And more generally, what's the role of what will be the role of artificial intelligence in food systems in the future?
Can you repeat the first part? Sorry.
Yes, of course. What would you say to those who argue that all possible interactions, even those currently outside human understanding, will be grasped and understood in the future by artificial intelligence?
Well, I'm not so much, thank you for the question, actually, it's inspiring, but I'm not so much an AI expert, I must say. But what I observe, and this has to do with some of the other questions before, I see there's a lot of promising and futuring around. I mean, all these technologies will solve the problem somewhere in the future. And this is really something I'm always skeptical. And it sometimes turns out that there's a reason to be skeptical. And again, I'm not anti-technologist, but I think to like reveal, or let's say exposing these promises as what they are is important also for in education. I mean, this is to add what you just said, Angelica, to also teach students that many of these promises are promises, they are claims, but they have no or little empirical evidence, and it's kind of open. And that's everything I can say on AI, because I don't know. I think AI will not solve the structural problems of our food systems, will not solve social justice issues, even more so will kind of perpetuate existing inequalities. I mean, we know that from other fields. So I would be, let's say, yeah, like hesitant in hoping too much from AI. In brief, maybe.
Nick, do you have a thought? You look like
Yeah,
you're
well,
about to speak.
it's a thought which very briefly comes from some of the earlier discussion as well, because I think one of the key issues we face in training scientists is that we focus very strongly on developing specialists and have insufficient generalists within the system that are able to see the interconnections between issues and maybe more able to see the potential for unintended consequences of certain technologies and so on. And I think particularly if AI begins to have more of a role in generating individual technologies, individual products, we need more trained capacities within the research environment with that generalist systems understanding so that they can take a critical overall interpretation. It's very tempting to think AI could capture all the knowledge and replace the need for generalists, but I think that would be a mistaken view of the role that generalists and systems thinkers can bring to understanding overall system functioning.
I think that's a very good point. Thank you, Nick. And I'm aware that we are running out of time. There are a number of questions that haven't been answered. If they are specific to you speakers, may I put them to you after the event and maybe we can try and get some answers for people? That would be fantastic. How to sum up, always my least favorite part of these discussions. I think, first of all, to be critical of the way that we approach sustainability, and particularly with regard to techno fixes, is not to be anti-science and it is not to be anti-GMO. Genetic engineering technology is here. It's not going away. It may well show promise at some point in the future. But as has been, the point has been amply made, I think, right now, that there is a lot of futuring, a lot of future-facing statements about what could maybe possibly eventually happen. These are not scientific statements, they are marketing statements. And if you were to be in America where you're trying to raise money for your biotech venture, there would be a great big warning on your pitch that these are future-facing statements and not statements of fact. But whether we're using technology that is high tech, or whether we're using technology that is low tech, or whether we're trying to produce coherent policy around sustainability, it seems very clear to me that we're going to need more than just future-facing statements and promises. We need to have some sense of forecaring is the only word I can think of, to precaution, forecaring, all these words that biotech developers hate, and yet they are important for our sustainability and stability in the long term. Sustainability is going to continue to be an incredibly difficult and complex issue. As Nick has amply said, there are trade-offs. Sustainability is not about, as one of our questioners asked, doing whatever you want forever. There are trade-offs, and those trade-offs may change from time to time as conditions change externally, as our climate changes, the geography changes, whatever. And so the idea that you can just set into stone a particular way of working and never change that is completely unrealistic. And in terms of gene editing, I suppose my advice to developers, what I'm taking away from this now, is your need to be flexible and have foresight in what you're doing is actually what may preserve the benefits of what you're doing rather than threaten that. You developers quite often make promises about what will happen, but they don't necessarily follow through. As you can say, the business model of biotech is not particularly sustainable. It's very boom and bust. All the things that stand in the way of perhaps applying gene editing as a sustainable food solution are to do with the poor structure of how it is developed and how it is pushed. So, you know, let's take that on board and maybe try something else. But I think also we have to understand that there is a skepticism around this technology. It's not widely accepted by consumers. It's not widely accepted by farmers. That skepticism, I think, should be taken seriously. Again, because it's asking important questions that don't get asked in the policy arena about transparency and honesty and where we are going and what our vision for the food system is. So we've covered all of those in a kind of whirlwind today, and I'm so grateful for our speakers for bringing all their wisdom and enthusiasm to a topic that, of course, we can't solve in 90 minutes, and we will keep talking about it. Certainly, we intend to keep talking about it at a bigger conversation. We are working on a sustainability report for later in this year, and so this has been very instructive for me. And I think we'll stop it there. I think there's no easy wrap up to this. There's no tie it up with a pretty bow and hey presto, we've done sustainability. But thank you so much for a really thought-provoking session, everybody. And I look forward to more contact with all of you. And for those of you who are attending, we'll make sure to be in touch with you with recordings as soon as we possibly can.